This is Cults and the Culting of America podcast with scholar of cults, extreme groups, and extremely bad leadership, Daniela Mestenek Young. I'm your host, Scott Lloyd. Welcome to another edition of Cults and the Culting of America podcast. My name is Scott Lloyd, along with my friend Daniela Mestenek Young, also known as the Knitting Cult Lady. Daniela, it's good to see you today.
Great to be here. Business is open.
Absolutely. And we have a wonderful guest with us today, Beatrice Weber. And Beatrice, I was watching a little bit of your content today, just getting to know you. And you have an amazing story that goes along with everything that we talk about on this podcast. Speaking of high control groups, cults, and the interspersion of religion as well, your story is simply amazing. So if you just do us the honor of introducing yourself and telling our audience a little bit about what you've experienced.
Yeah, thank you. So wonderful to be here with Scott and you, Daniela, as well. So I grew up in the Hasidic community, which is a sect in Judaism. People hesitate to call it a cult, so I'll be putting that to the side for this moment because it's more about what it was like growing up there and what it is like growing up there for the hundreds of thousands of people who are there, for the children growing up there, what it looks like on a day-to-day basis. That's critical. But I've definitely learned through understanding how cults operate. It has helped me with my experience of understanding what happened to me. When I made a decision to leave after many, many years, I was in my 40s. After having 10 children, I was just like so confused about what happened to me? How did it happen? And understanding it within the larger context of, high control groups, cults, fundamentalism, it made it so much easier for me to process all of that. So I'm so grateful to Daniela for your work and Scott for your work. It's so critical for so many people around the world.
It's wonderful to have you. Yeah.
I was going to say, this is what kind of this channel, but also when I wrote my book, that's what I was trying to show, except from the opposite perspective of everyone calls the children of God a cult and then proceeds to think they have nothing in common with it. Yeah. But when you actually tell the stories, right, and realize the similarities,
yeah.
I think it doesn't honestly matter what name we put on it. It's what are the parallels? Yeah. And here we try to focus on the tactics. What are the tactics, techniques, and procedures of cults that we can identify in different places? Tell us about it.
Yeah. So, there's so much to say. I lived in it for 45 years. I grew up in the Hasidic community. It was all I knew. All my relatives were part of the community. I did go to an Orthodox school, which meant, there's different groups. So the Hasidic community would be considered part of the larger Orthodox community. That's also essentially fundamentalist, that believes in the literal meaning of the Bible and all of that. It's just a little less high control. So I had that much exposure, but that was it. We didn't speak to people. Even though I lived on a block in Toronto with other families, we didn't talk to anybody who was not Orthodox or Hasidic. We didn't have any friends. I remember there being a conversation about, in the 80s, there was a time where people were joining, in the 70s and 80s, people were joining the community. Small percentages, but there were people joining. So people would host others on, weekend on Shabbat dinners. But I remember my parents having the conversation about we don't do that because we don't allow people who are not on our standard to even be around the table. So the children shouldn't be exposed to any questions or anything. So it's pretty amazing how, we didn't live in a compound. I went on the train and went to downtown for doctor's appointments, but yet so isolated. And I think the additional fact that, I was a Holocaust survivor. My four grandparents were all Holocaust survivors. Most of the people I knew came from Holocaust survivors. families, there was kind of that added layer of trauma that gave the feeling of like, we're different. We need to protect ourselves. We need to stay separate. We need to stay different. And it's just the way it is. And if you do venture out, like everybody's out to get you. Like you're just going to be like destroyed completely. So there's a real fear of leaving. So there's so many tactics to talk about in terms of how people stay. Like, why do you stay?
Beatrice, I'm curious about something that you said, because growing up in a Christian cult and in a Christian community, most of what we were conditioned to do were to go out and to make disciples, right? To convert people. So in your tradition and in that high control group, what was the strategy? Was there a strategy? And if I remember my Old Testament correctly, I mean, you had Jewish people like Daniel, obviously in the Old Testament, that was a great influence when they were in a different country and things of that nature. So how did your community work around those particular stories, or did they try to convert anybody to their perspective?
No.
Okay.
There is no mandate to bring anybody into the fold. In fact, there's a certain pride in understanding your ancestry and who you came from. And like I was told that I have direct lineage to, King David. Like you can argue with me, but like that's what we were told. And like my father would show me these like long papers with like names and names and names and names of people, So no, there's no proselytizing at all. There is one sect in the in the Hasidic that's a little different. They proselytize within Jewish people. Okay, so there's Jewish people, about 16 million Jewish people in the world. About 9% of them are Orthodox. So that means 91% of them have like more of a casual relationship, and don't believe in the literal translation of the Bible, in varying degrees, but have more of a modern perspective on science. Some observe different practices in different levels. Some don't observe at all. And then there's 9% that take the Bible literally. So the world was created 6,000 years ago. It was created in 7 days. These are the commandments. I know sometimes, I'll hear Christians making fun of the commandment of like linen and wool. We did not wear linen and wool together. There were special labs that would check our clothing to make sure that it didn't have any linen and wool. And every now and then there'd be like a notice in a newspaper, like this and this suit from this and this store, contains that fabric. Don't wear that. So it was a lot of kind of the literal, but not really. Like yes and no, right? It was also pick and choose. But out of that 9%, I believe about 30% of the 9% are Hasidic. So there's, even within that kind of Orthodox umbrella, there's a spectrum. There are people who go to college who are highly educated. In fact, I think the modern Orthodox, which is under this umbrella, have from the highest salary ranges from like all the Jewish groups. So there are differences, right? The group that I came from, the boys didn't go to high school at all. I didn't graduate high school. I went to college like way later. But like my brothers and my sons, none of them went to high school. That was just accepted. You just went to religious school, and even at the elementary school was like a minimal amount of English. My brothers did speak English, and so did my sons, because I spoke to them in English, but like they couldn't write an essay in English or a paragraph in English. So that the group that I come from very much restricts education and has extremely strict rules around like separation between the genders, like from when you're really, really little, and then so many rules around sex in general once you're married. It's very invasive and very controlling, and rules and rules. And it's like the rules have grown over the years. There was always a rule, like you need to dress modest, you need to wear skirts, and kind of knee was somehow brought in, but now it's like the skirts have to be 4 inches below your knee. And like my daughter at one point was working, with one of the teachers at school, and they kind of created this invention where there was like a ruler, so you can actually make sure that your skirt is at least 4 inches below your knee, but it couldn't be too long, because if it's too long, it's casual. So again, I think it's important to remember, like, Judaism is kind of this weird mix of ethnicity and religion, right? So, but in terms of the organized religion control part, that's like a relatively small percentage. And I don't know the exact number, but it's definitely below a million, definitely probably closer to about 500,000. Rapidly growing, though. I mean, I had 10 children of my own, and right now I have 12 grandchildren, and, we're just at the beginning, so.
Yeah, I want to go back to one of the things you said when you were talking about the Holocaust. Because we see in high control groups, right, this us versus them. The outside world is bad, the outside world is out to get you. And one of the things, when we're looking at like white American cults, it's usually made up, right? That persecution complex is usually made up. But when we're looking at these minority groups, a lot of times it's real, right? Like, as you said, almost everyone in that community comes from a Holocaust survivor. When we're looking at Black cults like Nation of Islam, right? Like, they're able to use this, like, white America hates you, which is true, but still within that space, right? Like, it can be used for control and it can be used for predators as well.
For sure. Absolutely. Like, I think about my mother's parents. So they were both from Hungary, and they survived the Holocaust in different ways. My grandmother was, the story goes, I'm never sure about what the stories really were, but the story goes, she had kind of lighter colored hair and blue eyes. So she got fake papers, and she worked at a hospital. And the story with my grandfather was that the priest offered to hide him, but he's like, there's no way I can stay. And he ended up in the concentration camps, lost a wife and 2 children, which we only found out like years later. He never spoke about it. Whatever it is, it's 1946. They're still in Hungary. It becomes communist. They freak out. They don't want to stay here. They have relatives in Morocco, Tangiers, Morocco, which they have the resources. They're able to escape there. They go there. They live there for 6 years, 7 years. They have 5 children. And then it's like, okay, we can't stay here forever. We knew this was going to be like just a resting place. Where do we go now? So they grew up, very Orthodox, but they chose to move to Williamsburg, in Brooklyn, Williamsburg, where there was a rabbi that was gaining a lot of power. And he was like, come, I'll take care of you. I'll save you. He personally was an extremist and had a lot of extremist tendencies, and had a huge impact on the Hasidic community as a whole in the United States and in Israel. And, a controversial person. And they latched on. And, the story goes, my grandfather said, if I'll be next to him, I'll be okay. So yes, the Holocaust happened. Yes. I mean, I once went on to Ancestry to see like all the relatives who died. Like there's like dozens of children. I mean, it's awful, awful, but that is not an excuse to like control people. And it's not true that everybody hates you. Like, for me, it was like, I did a lot of kind of processing work around it, and then like realized like, oh my gosh, every single one of my grandparents was saved by a non-Jewish person, right? Like, my other grandmother came out with a kinder transport. She was 18, but they managed to get her out there. And my other grandfather, which was weird a little bit, but his father was a rabbi. He himself was a ping pong player, which was like kind of rebellious, but he had a friend in London who managed to get him a visa. So the stories that we were told about everybody being out to get us, it scares you. And, again, they can bring examples, but it's not true. I think anybody who has left the community, though I will say, some people reacted, even people who left, like I know a lot of people who left the community, and after October 7th, there was a very strong reaction, which to me, very much a trauma reaction of like, oh my gosh, like my parents were right. Like they were right. You see, they're just out to get us and we're all going to be destroyed. And it's like a huge wake up.
Yeah.
Damn.
And, this is where I think it's really significant to understand that the people that join these communities and high control groups and cults, like they're seekers, and they're seekers for a reason. because there are real problems in the world, right? Like they came here running for their lives, and then next generation comes out, and then this happens. And it's been really interesting because I've had so many formerly Hasidic Jewish people ask me to talk about it. And of course, like, Americans are also afraid to talk about Hasidic Judaism because they're afraid of being seen as anti-Semitic. And this is another thing that cults and high control groups will actually use. So like recently in the news was Shen Yun, the dance show, which is like the funding arm of Falun Gong. And they like use the fact that Americans are xenophobic against the Chinese to just be like, oh, the Chinese government hates us. And Americans are like, yes, yes, yes. Okay, here's our money. And reality is they're just like playing that off of each other.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I just want to say I've been called anti-Semitic many times. Part of the work I do is improving education for Hasidic kids. I won the first case against New York City, New York State on my son's school, which is amazing. And I, work for an organization that continues to push forward this work, that these yeshivas are receiving, like, they estimate about $250 million a year, and they're not teaching the kids. As I mentioned to you before, they're not teaching them the basic subjects that they're supposed to at all. So I work towards that. And people have called me all kinds of awful things. It's just like, it's really hard to call, like I'm literally like, my DNA is like 100% Ashkenazi Jewish. Like, calling me anti-Semitic is like a real stretch when I want to improve. I'm talking about improving something for these kids. So yes, it's used quite, and it really does make organizations like this one that works for this, even when we're working in the community, so careful about what we say and how we say it. So it's a problem, but it's not an excuse to do awful things.
Right.
So, it has to be separated out. Having such control over people, literally taking away people's individuality, right to choice, which to me is like human. Being human is being free and having choice. There's no excuse for that ever.
Beatrice, as a woman in that community for so long, what was your status as a person? Were you considered property of your husband, or were you considered an individual with rights? What did that look like in your particular community, and when did it start to dawn on you that something was amiss?
So there's all these rules, right? There's a lot of rules. And you're told those are, God's words, right? That from a really, really young age. So from a very young age, boys and girls are completely different, completely separate, completely different. Boys have like a ceremony at 3 to turn them into like young men. That's when they get the side curls and they start wearing the skull cap. It's a whole ceremony. It's a party. Rabbis, girls, just like they turn 3. And then they start wearing long skirts. And in some communities, they start wearing tights. I started wearing tights when I was 9. So I was considered relatively modern by some of my cousins. So like from a really young age, boys are supposed to study the Torah, which is what we call the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, are supposed to study. Girls, not really. Some communities allow it. Some communities don't even allow the girls to open a book of the Hebrew Bible at all, right? So from a really young age, it's really clear. From 3 years old, you go into separate schools. You're not speaking or connecting with anybody, with anyone from the opposite gender. Even like first cousins are discouraged from even speaking to each other past the age of like 10 or 11. So it's so clear what the role is. And, we're taught like things like you go to heaven, because we were taught about heaven, even though some people say Jewish people not, we were. And, a woman gets to heaven if she supports her husband in his studies and sends the children to school. So from a really young age, it's really clear. Again, at the bar mitzvah, boys turn 13, huge party, start wearing the hat, the black jacket. And girls just become 12. And where I come from, no party, no celebration, nothing. It was considered like immodest to celebrate out loud and publicly. From 13 or even younger than that, the boys are, if you look at what like a Friday night and Shabbat dinner, right? Every Saturday is the 26 hours. You don't do any work, and you eat these 2 huge meals. Man sitting at the head of the table, the wife is running around serving the food, the girls are helping serving the food, and for the most part, the boys and the men are talking about their studies. So it's not even spoken about. It's just so ingrained in the way life and society is. So my parents became wealthy over the years. So the marriages are arranged, okay, and there's very much it's not an official caste system, but there's kind of you're matched up based on your status, right? So because of the kind of lineage I came from, and my father was wealthy by the time I was a teenager, I was considered a catch. Okay, so a catch meant, from the kind of subculture that I came from, was marrying someone who was a scholar and who would continue studying for many, many years. Okay, so I'll just say this. Then I was literally a piece of property. Like, there's no other way to describe that. But, my now ex-husband was studying in Israel, but before he came back, and the matchmaker called up, she has this idea, but before he came back, my in-laws visited us, and the mother came to check me out to see if I was suitable, and the father came to discuss business arrangements with my father. And my father promised a fully paid off house and 5 years of full support, which ended up becoming 15. And based on that, they were willing to bring him home to meet with me. And we met and got engaged. There was very little, in theory, and this is again based on biblical things. In theory, you're supposed to meet and agree, but for all practical purposes, there's very little choice. I will say I come from a sect that I met him 3 times for an hour around the dining room table. There is a sect I know that they meet for 20 minutes and then they get engaged. So the reason you meet, and with your backgrounds, you probably know. So when, I don't know how you say it a little differently, when Lavan tricked Jacob, right, with the wives. So the idea is, like, make sure you're getting the right, so you get to check. And there's actually a check right before they get married, like right before they walk down the aisle, there's like another check that happens. So like during my marriage process, absolutely, I was literally being sold to, for like I don't know, the highest, like we were the highest bidder. So that's what happened. But I'll just say, like, when I was 15 or 16, I had a lot of questions and I was being quite rebellious. But my parents quickly tamped me down and sent me to Northern England to a seminary, a religious seminary, which I learned a lot of, there was more rules, and it was more structured and more strict. And it was like, when you behave, you can come come back home. It was an awful experience and scared me. And I sometimes think back to then when I was 16, I actually, at one point, so my parents moved, we grew up in Toronto and they moved to a different city. And it was really hard for me moving in the middle of high school. And I so badly wanted to finish high school there, because it was an Orthodox school, but still we were getting a high school diploma. We learned Shakespeare. We were learning French. We were getting a structure of an education. And I tried desperately. I remember speaking to the principal, begging him to let me stay and graduate. But my parents had a lot of power in the community, and there was no way. And that was that. I finished high school, halfway through. But I think that experience scared me, so that when I came back, I was like, okay, whatever, I'll do whatever you say.
And isn't it interesting that even when you describe that, when you were a teenager, you used words like rebellious. And I think in all of the groups that we came of age in, I know I asked a lot of questions. I was labeled obnoxious. Daniela, you were isolated because you talked too much, right? And so there's all of that that we now look back on and say we were inquisitive people. We wanted to know more about the world, and because that threatened the power structures of the communities that we came of age in, and certainly it was far more difficult for you two as women. we look back on that, and that language still even sort of resides in our memory. But so you got married. It was an arranged marriage, and how did that work initially?
So as I mentioned before, you're not speaking to anybody from the opposite gender for years, right? You're segregated, completely different schools, synagogues. So if you ever saw a movie with a synagogue and there's like a balcony, that's not the kind of synagogue that we went to. Like, not at all. The synagogues that we went to, it was usually a completely separate room. The fancier ones, there was a one-way mirror, so the women can see the men, but the men couldn't see the women. But oftentimes there was like a window cut out, and then it would have like slats. So with these tiny little peepholes. So women did not participate in prayer services or any of that. They were observers. So also, just when you asked me the differences, like, it was just clear. Men were not allowed to hear a woman sing, okay, because it would tempt him. Women weren't allowed to wear red. Okay, because that would be, so there's so many rules. So then it's like, okay, here's the boy, like, here he is, and like, you're supposed to have a conversation. So you can imagine how awkward and uncomfortable, and you don't even know what to talk about, and you basically know you're going to marry this person, like, unless like something like huge happens, right? You're marrying this person, so there's no sex ed either, okay, at all. Nothing, no conversation. My mother did tell me before I got my period, so at least I knew to expect that. But there was no conversation, not even a conversation. There was no even conversation about abstinence. It was just like, there were rules around. You weren't allowed to be in the same room as a man. There were like a lot of rules. It was like there's like a whole, like, books written about this, about all the rules, right? So if the husband's in town and he can come in at any minute, then if the door's left a little bit open, then it's okay. Like, it's kind of gets very legalistic. So those are the kind of rules we were taught, but never anything related to sex or anything like that. So when you get engaged, there were special classes that you would go to. So some people go to group classes, but again, because my parents, were wealthier and we were fancier, so I got one-on-one classes, 12 classes that I go to once a week. The bulk of those classes were dedicated to the rules around what is called Taharat HaMishpacha, which is the purity of the family. Okay, so the 3 pillars of what makes you an Orthodox, also, all the Orthodox people keep this too, or Hasidic Jew, was keeping kosher, keeping Shabbat with all the rules, and these rules, this package of rules. And so there are many, many rituals that come into play. There was no conversation about consent at all. In fact, you were encouraged to go along with whatever, he wants. There was, a conversation about what the process actually looked like. There was no conversation about birth control or anything like that. And again, most of the time was dedicated to the rules. So what are the rules? Briefly, there's a ritual bath in each community that would be used before you get married, right? Before the first night of the wedding. A whole process of how you have to clean yourself and wash yourself before, to make sure that your body's touching all the water. And then after you get your period and after you count 7 days, you have to go to the ritual bath again. Always. And there are people there that watch you to make sure. And again, like, so many rules around it, like so many rules. There's also, so the way it works is, so you get married, right? First night. I wrote an essay about it, actually, called The First Night. It's I think I have 2 essays that are on Huffington Post. The one on my blog is the most popular one, The First Night. So you have never been in a room alone with a man before that night, right? So you have your whole, big shebang of a wedding, which was full of rituals. There's the marriage ritual, but then after the dinner, there's another whole ritual, which is actually a pretty strange ritual. I should probably describe it, because like, so what happens is like everybody clears out and like close family stays. So let's say just your cousins stay. The weddings are usually very big, done in wedding halls, and the men sit on one side, the women sit on the other side, and then the husband comes and sits next to you. Oh, the whole wedding happens in basically two separate rooms, right? The men are in one room, the women are in one room. So you don't really see the person that you got married to the whole wedding. Right after the ceremony, you go into a room alone for a few minutes, and then afterwards you're in two separate rooms. And then, so the ceremony that happens, that's only in Hasidic groups, that the woman now dances with the male relatives, but she holds a string. Okay, so there's like this rope that you're holding, and then first it's the uncles, and then it's the other uncles, and then it becomes like the grandfathers, and then the fathers, and then finally you dance with your husband, and then you're actually holding his hand. So it's just like, if you think about it, for all these years, right, you've been separated. It's just it's intense and it's hard. And if you can look it up, it's pretty wild, and it's not conversation. It's just,
it makes me think of, like, when you're describing this, it makes me think of how Mormons describe when they go to the temple when they're 18, and like their whole life has been leading up to this, but nobody talks about it. And then you go in and it's this incredibly weird ceremony. And actually, like, it doesn't surprise me to hear you say that, like, oh yeah, it's actually kind of weird, because this is a tool of high control groups, is like getting you to do weird stuff in front of other people, because then social proof, like, everyone's doing it, nobody's saying it's weird, so okay, I guess I'll go along with it. And that's what I've had so many ex-Mormons describe to me. They were like, that was the moment the brainwashing cracked, but I still had to like go through this ceremony.
Yeah. And what you described, it almost sounds like a passing. You were the chain of custody, right? You danced with all of the male relatives, and then finally you were given, as you described yourself, as really a piece of property to your husband.
Yeah. And then you go home and you are required to consummate your marriage, right? Like you're, it's interesting speaking to men from the Hasidic community. It's often as uncomfortable for them as it is for the women, because they're also, in some of the Hasidic sects, they are only permitted to learn about sex at all the night before their wedding. So some of the men don't even know. Okay, by now there's, the internet, so a lot of them get access to different things, so they know it's probably less of that. But I remember when I got married, hearing stories where men would faint, like they'd go to their teacher and their teacher would be like, okay, this is what you're going to do tomorrow. Because men, from when they're little, are being taught that they're not allowed to look at women and that women are impure. My 7-year-old son came home from school. His teacher had told him a whole story about, a man was walking down the street and a woman, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, no, like, it's okay. So they're being like told how the women are like the source of, evil and impurity. And then all of a sudden it's like, well, guess what you're going to be doing tomorrow?
Yeah.
So there's so much shame, for men. And I think people are more comfortable maybe talking about how hard it is for women, but sometimes it's hard to talk about what the experience is for men, I think, for different reasons. But the shame that they put into them about masturbation from such a young age, it's just awful. It's just awful. And I've seen so many men, they leave the community, and it's so hard for them to like leave the misogynistic beliefs, especially because, it's easy to find company outside of the community.
Right. When the whole society supports that, right?
Supports that. Yeah. But I just want to say, like, they suffer as well. Like, they go,
absolutely.
Like, it's not, it's not just the women. But yeah, you're required to consummate that marriage. But added to that, so you've never touched a man before. Like, you've never touched, kissed, anything. Added to that is the moment you see bleeding, a woman sees bleeding, she's forbidden from touching her husband and forbidden from, he's not allowed to see her dressed immodestly. He's not allowed to listen to her sing. All the rules go as if he wasn't her husband, basically. So, there's this like stress because the minute you're expected to bleed, and then like he has to basically jump off your bed, and you have to wait, count 5 days and 7 days, and then go to the ritual bath again, and then you start all over again.
Yeah.
And this is what happens throughout your marriage. I was pregnant by a month after I was married. I was pregnant. I could have gotten pregnant that first night too. There would have been nothing to stop that. I wouldn't even have known how to not get pregnant. I would have had no idea. I know I was given some medication before I got married. There was this woman that would give medication to like the brides, and it was to make sure that they get their periods at the right time so that when they do get married that night, they should not have the problem of getting their period, because then they wouldn't be able to consummate their marriage. And then it's a whole complicated situation because you're not allowed to be alone with them in the room. So I'm still not sure what I was given, but I was given something. But I would not have, might have been birth control to like control, but I would not have known like who to ask. Let's say I would have decided I don't want to get pregnant right away. I am 18 after. I would not have known what to do. I would not have known who to ask and what to do. I would have been like deathly embarrassed to ask a doctor, because like the doctor probably would have told my parents that I'm asked. I wouldn't have known what to do. And it would have so anyway, I got pregnant, after a month, I was pregnant. And then we moved to Israel with,
Wow. You've lived such a very intense life.
Oh my gosh.
So can you tell us a little bit about just like the decision to leave?
Yeah. So, what's interesting? I'm finding that this, not for everybody. Some people leave younger. I think nowadays you have a lot of people who don't believe, who stay in the community. People, I think, are exposed. The internet does expose people to more information. The community tries desperately to control the internet. It's considered the worst thing. You have to have a filter on your internet if you use it for business. Like, they really try really hard. But I think the estimates are probably about 50% of the people have smartphones, even though they're not supposed to. They hide them. But when I was a kid, there was none of that. It was much harder to have access to information. But a lot of people, like from my experience was, my ex-husband was a really he was a very hurtful person to me. He was very unkind and hurtful, and it was an abusive marriage, and I was very much just trying to make him happy, make everybody happy, and make my grandparents happy, and make the whole world happy. And by the time, when I was 21, I had 3 kids. I felt like I had like literally gotten an A+ in like doing what I was supposed to do. But it was a really, really rough marriage straight from the beginning. I mean, I'll give you one example. So I'm pregnant with this baby. I'm living in Israel. I start bleeding in the morning, a Saturday morning, and my ex-husband is it's Shabbos. We can't call. I'm going to go to shul. We'll see how you're feeling when I get back. Okay. So I'm like barely 19, pregnant, bleeding, cramping, laying in bed, waiting for him to come back. I'm terrified to pick up the phone because, I'm not allowed to pick up the phone, right? Until he comes back 2 hours later. By the time I get to the hospital, 6 centimeters dilated, she's going to be born. We held her off for another 2.5 days. She was fine. But just like, I mean, I can tell you stories and stories of just outside the norm of even men in the community. He had been raised, he was a smart kid, and he had been raised that he's going to be the next huge rabbi. And like, so the men are told, like, the world was created for men to study the Torah, the Hebrew Bible. That's why the world was created, period. So a guy that learns and does well kind of develops the status. So that's how he treated me, right? And it's your job to serve me. So it's just awful. And, it's hard for me to talk about it. And it's harder for me to realize that my parents saw and knew and really didn't care because it looked good on the outside, because, he was highly regarded for his learning. And then after I had my 8th child, I had a miscarriage, and a similar situation happened. But then I did call the ambulance. It was also a Shabbos, and then I did call the ambulance because by then I had 8 kids, and I was like, I need to be alive and I am too dizzy and I don't care if you let me call the ambulance or not, I will call an ambulance. And then I got back home and we had just moved, and he wouldn't go to stores and he wouldn't drive because he was a rabbi, and I would do all that stuff. And then we had just moved and he was like sending me to Home Depot to buy insulation for the door downstairs because there was too much noise and it was disturbing his study. And I have these 8 little kids, plus just recovering from miscarriage. I finally fell apart, like about time. I'm like 32, and went to a doctor and was like, I feel awful. I feel terrible. And of course, I'm fine. He's like, maybe therapy. So I was able to go to therapy, and thank goodness in those days, they didn't have Hasidic therapists. Now they trained a whole bunch of licensed Hasidic therapists. It is awful. I mean, it is awful what they're doing. They're training, they're getting them licensed. Some of them are even doing conversion therapy. I mean, it's just awful what's going on in there. And they're licensed, so they're getting paid as if they're licensed. But back then they didn't have that many. So I went to an Orthodox therapist, but starting to kind of find my voice, find who I am, what I am. After a year, went to college, got a job, but I very much was planning on staying in the community. And I'm like, oh my gosh, something's wrong in my marriage. We need to fix this. Kind of knew my marriage couldn't be fixed, but by then I had my 9th child. I'm like, I have to make this work. What am I going to do? Then finally, 7 years later, I left. By then I had 10 children. My youngest was 1.5 years, and I left my marriage. Okay. My ex-husband said, you can leave me. You'll never see any of the children. And he started turning the older ones against me. And I was like, oh my gosh, I really won't see any of my children. It was manipulative with my parents and my siblings. So I left the marriage, and I managed to leave with my 4 youngest ones in the middle of the night. Yes, that was another intense moment for sure. But I did get out. And the impetus for me thinking about leaving was the shock of how I was treated by the rabbis. Because my parents had money and my ex was a scholar, I was kind of given better treatment, shall I say. I never had to touch like really hard edges, even though like now I say the stories and I'm like, oh my gosh, it was rough. But like sometimes people who are in the community are faced with bigger crises earlier, shall we say. But here I trusted the rabbis who knew what my marriage was like, would stick up for me, help me. Meanwhile, I went first to family court, managed to get custody of all the kids, but my parents came with my ex-husband and my older children and a bunch of relatives to support him in getting custody of the children. But I was successful in maintaining custody. $20,000 later, which was like a month later, ran out of money, and my parents were, oh, you go to the rabbis, they'll help you work it out. And I was very trusting. And I went to them, a group, 3 rabbis, and they did this whole little fake court situation. But they worked really hard to try to take all the kids from me, and ultimately gave a ruling which they entered into family court to try to make the ruling that all the kids would go to him. But I was able to fight back, and have been fighting for the last over 10 years. But I was shocked and horrified. And that really set me on an introspective journey of like, how was I raised? What is all of this? Do I even want all of this? How does this all make sense? And it's been an ongoing, joyous, exhilarating, painful, all the things journey, and it's an ongoing journey. And I learned a lot from there is support within the community for people who leave the Hasidic community, but I learned a lot from the outside space. I remember in 2017, that's when I was still in the community, I spoke to a ex-Mormon, and we were having this conversation. I was saying, like, we were told, we're the chosen ones, right? It's all for us. And she's like, I remember once talking to a friend about, like, does it make sense that like us in Utah, out of all the billions of people, we're the chosen one? I'm like, oh my gosh, like it's all the same. Like that
Yeah.
was so helpful. I will say it's the beliefs when they're taught to you at such a young age with nobody, like everybody in the trusted circle saying the same thing, and then you live, it's really hard.
So this is, something interesting. Like when we talk about indoctrination and thought reform, like that can only be done to a certain age of person, because you have to push yourself past like illogical things. So when young children are raised the way you were, the way I was, where you're completely isolated and you're only given one thing, that is called mind rape, right? And like that's what's happening. That's why we have such a hard time, right? Because we were just like me, like you, like we weren't even given the concept of another way of living that was even like out there, right? Like everything was just evil. And I do want this to be one of the things that listeners walk away from this was like the outside world as a whole wasn't evil, right?
Yeah.
Didn't turn out to be evil for me, didn't turn out to be evil for you, didn't turn out to be evil for Scott. We've all met people completely unreligious or from different religions who are incredibly kind and incredibly helpful. And I always want people to know that it's like, it's a tactic of abusers and coercive people who are trying to control you to tell you that everyone outside is horrible.
Yeah. And if you're told that from a young enough age and everyone around you says that, then you just believe it. I mean, I'll just say this, at the Passover Seder every year, one of the like highlights is you stand up and you hold a cup of wine and you say, in every generation, they come up to destroy us, but we like overcome it. Yeah.
Beatrice, I'm interested in how you are now channeling everything that you've experienced, and can I just say the courage and the wherewithal to get through what you have come through. It's a testament to who you are as a person, and wow, just wow. So what are you doing now? I know you mentioned the lawsuit against the school that you brought and was able to win. I know that you're involved in education reform as well now.
Yeah. You're catching me at a very, very interesting time. I think for the first time, maybe in my whole life, but definitely since I left my marriage 10.5 years ago, I'm not in like an active fight. So I was in family court for like 10 years, had times that it was slower, times that it was more intense. And when I filed the lawsuit against my son's school in 2019, it ramped up. So from 2019 till 2024, it was like insane with like the most expensive lawyers money could buy, because what happens in the community is oftentimes when someone leaves the community will fundraise for the spouse that remains in the community. So that's what happened. He just got like endless money. So and then I was dealing with family court number one, but also filing this lawsuit. So I was dealing with like regular court and the pushback that I was getting, including losing my job and needing to find new housing. So for the first time, I'm not in this active fight, and it's really, I kind of knew this would happen, but it's interesting to see how hard that is when I've been full on fighting. And I'm like, I did well with the fight, but still full on. And now it's just like life. What do you do with life? So I was the executive director of that organization for a year and a half, a small nonprofit that fights for education for Hasidic kids. And that involved, legal work, working with lawyers, working with legislators. And I won a bunch of awards and was honored for a bunch of different things. And I'm super proud of that work. But it was taking a toll on me. And I really had to finally acknowledge that everything I've been through like affected me, like didn't want to admit that because I'm a fighter and I want to say like I can just keep on going. So I did step down as the executive director, and now I work part-time as a senior advisor, and I'm looking for what to do next. Maybe healthcare, which is what I was in before, which would be work, but not as intense. I do have a literary agent, so hopefully we'll get a book out soon. So I'm definitely still very active and speaking up. People don't like to speak up about these issues. It hurts me to see how quickly politicians and people whitewash all of this, and especially around the education piece. You have communities in New York State where you have young men who cannot speak English. Like I know this because I worked at a clinic, recently heard from a doctor, like you have grown men coming to him and they can't tell him what hurts, to a cardiologist, and they can't express a sentence of what hurts. I mean, it's inexcusable. And never mind, the poverty in certain areas and the lack of, what happens is, because they don't get high school diplomas, they could only get jobs from people in the community. So they're stuck in the community, so they can't speak up, because if they speak up, they'll lose their housing, they'll lose their job, they'll lose their family. So it's just a whole crazy cycle. And politicians, none of them, neither side of the aisle, none of them care. None of them. I'll just say that. Like, none of them are good on this. Not one. Like, it's like a constant battle. We have like one or two heroes, in Albany that we know we can count on. Everybody else, they'll throw these kids under the bus for 1,000 votes in a heartbeat. So it's hard to see it. So yeah, I'm really, what I'm doing now is just trying to see how do you live a life. Like, I created this amazing life. I live in an amazing apartment in Harlem. I have a little puppy. I have my 2 kids. I got my youngest son in a top school in New York City, Jewish school, but like top school. My daughter is an artist and works at an art studio all day. And I created this life, right? So how do I enjoy it, and enjoy it without the crazy intensity of what I was raised to be with,
So
So
this is one of the challenges for us, right? And you said intensity, right? Like, it's called an intensity addiction.
Yeah.
And there was this quote that really meant a lot to me a few years ago, and now I see it differently, but it says, we know we're healing when peace and tranquility no longer sound like boredom.
Mm.
And I used to see that as aspirational. And now I think, like, I'm learning how to live in my life that I've built. And, I tell people all the time, like, you're jonesing for the mission, and veterans get this when they leave the military. Like, what, I've even seen this in my own husband, right? Like, he was a special operations helicopter pilot. And he's like, I will never do anything cooler than that, right? For like the rest of my life. But one of the things I tell people a lot is, like, it's cool for your mission to be you.
Yeah.
It's time. Beatrice, you have been working since you were so young, lay on your couch, take months off, right? Like, this is what we have to go through. And I think it's like, in a way, it's good for people like you and people like me. I was exactly the same, right? Like, all this stuff would stop somebody else, but I can make it through. Like, I can do this. I can push. And to actually, like, be forced in some way or another to, like, slow down and just like, I want to give you such an applause for, like, the life that you built, right?
Yeah.
Phenomenal.
Absolutely.
You did it.
Yeah. I mean, I do want to add, because I know you talk about it. So before I left the community, my therapist recommended I join a 12-step group, which I know they do a lot of, which I'm finding out now. I'm not an addict. I'm not an alcoholic. I'm not a drug addict. I actually hate substances because I like to be in control. So that's like not my issue. First, it was for trauma. Then I did groups for money, for weight loss. It was terrible, especially for me, like for someone coming from my background. It was terrible. And I look back at, in some way, like with sadness that I put myself through that. On the other hand, I came from a system with such strong guardrails that maybe I needed like a transition period to finally get off. But it's not even been a year since I left kind of that space. And that's been an adjustment too. Like I can just choose what to do. There's no wrong and there's no right. There's no like next step that must be done in order to feel okay. So it's definitely been an adjustment to just live from my own truth, my own self, what I want, how I want, and discovering that, as a grown adult is definitely a challenge, but also nice, that I get to do that.
Beatrice, some of what I read about you intrigues me on the other side of this, because you, as I understand it, you've managed to hold on to some aspects of your faith and spirituality. And what does that look like for you these days?
That fluctuates so much. That really does. There are times when I'm like, I just want to close my door on all of it. And there are times when there are some practices that are nice. I don't go to anything, I don't participate in anything Orthodox. Like anything related to me, in my mind, anything that's Orthodox is fundamentalist. I don't want anything to do with fundamentalism, period. But, I live in New York. I mean, there's these very cool, very egalitarian, very liberal, very open spaces. I will now and then stop into, services on a Friday night where they have food and I get to meet all these like interesting people doing different kind of things. So I'll do that every now and then. I used to pray often in the mornings, again, very egalitarian, very different. I haven't done that in a long time. I like that I get to choose, now the high holidays, I didn't participate in any services. The high holidays were very intense, the way we were taught, like we were being judged, so it was like your life hung in the balance. And I always laugh because, so the Libra sign, right, which coincides with the holidays, is a scale. So we were taught, you see, God is holding a scale up in the sky and putting your good deeds and your bad deeds. But it was like real, like we'd cry, like it was like your life is going to be judged. So I often will not participate at all, even though like even secular Jews participate a little bit. And I'm like, whatever, I'll go to services. Like once that's all over, then I'll participate. But I did bake a few things that my grandmothers baked that felt like nice, connecting with my grandparents. My grandmothers especially. I feel a great kinship with my grandmothers. They were both survivors, but didn't have many options, right? They were going to get married. And again, they were very much under the rule of their husbands, for sure. But I feel like they'd be proud of me, for finding my voice and finding my way.
Absolutely. That's beautiful, Beatrice. Thank you for sharing a part of your story with us and with our audience. If folks want to follow up on what you're doing now, or perhaps when you have news to share about your forthcoming book, we're all looking forward to that. Where would they find information about you? Where can they follow you? Are you on social media?
Yeah, I'm on all the socials, and I have a website also, BeatriceWeber.com, just my name.com, the way it's spelled down here. And I'm on all the socials as well. So I'd love to hear from all the listeners.
And we will put all of those links in the show notes as well.
Okay, amazing.
Beatrice, thank you so much. It's been a wonderful conversation. Daniela, thank you. And to all of our listeners, do us a favor and like, subscribe, and share. Follow Daniela on TikTok and all of the socials, and do yourself a favor and pick up a copy of her book, Uncultured, if you haven't done so already. It's a great way to stay in contact with all of us. And until next time, I'm Scott Lloyd for Daniela and our special guest, Beatrice, and we'll see you on the next episode of Cults and the Culting of America.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Cults and the Culting of America. Be sure and follow Daniela on social media and subscribe to her Patreon page for exclusive content that you won't find anywhere else. Pick up her book, Uncultured. Until next time, I'm Scott Lloyd for Daniela Mestenek Young. We'll see you on the next episode of cults and the culting of America.